our broadcast tonight, defiant Vladimir Putin hitting back at the U.S. as Secretary of State John Kerry arrives in Kiev tonight, the very latest on a very dicey standoff. Trouble in the air, a record number of passengers hit hard, 80,000 flight cancellations during this winter of our discontent. Tonight, as we go inside the FAA Command Center, we'll see the decision-making behind it. The price you pay, a stunning new look at the cost of having a baby in America, more expensive than anywhere else in the world, and tonight why there's no rhyme or reason for it. And the surprise salute, a funny thing happened during a race in California when the runners spotted a reason to stop. Nightly News begins now.
From NBC News World Headquarters in New York, this is NBC Nightly News with Brian Williams.
Good evening. Vladimir Putin says Russian troops aren't occupying Crimea. They are apparently merely walking the streets and driving in convoys with weapons loaded and drawn. As this very tense Ukraine crisis continues, President Putin today was defiant. He spoke out today for the first time since the big escalation of this crisis in Ukraine. He hit back at the U.S., and to no one's surprise, he said he had no intention of changing his course now. U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry arrived in Kiev today, and listening to the comments from these two men from two different places was indeed like sampling two different worlds. NBC's Andrea Mitchell is traveling with the Secretary of State, who tonight has landed in Paris. Andrea, good evening.
Good evening, Brian. This has been a remarkable day, traveling with the Secretary of State to Kiev. What began as a show of solidarity with the Ukrainian people became so much more as the impact of what had happened in that square took hold with the Secretary of State. At John Kerry's first stop, the streets where Ukraine's people rose up in the face of live gunfire from their own government, the Secretary of State was swept up by the powerful emotion of the place, taking in the barricades of tires and barbed wire, where mourners now leave flowers and candles.
But this is so dramatic, this setting, this view of all the flowers and the shrines. It's quite amazing.
People crowded around him. One woman said, "We are poor, they are rich," referring to the former government leaders who had fled.
Are you going to help us to make sure that everything is well in order?
We're going to do our best.
Secretary Kerry comes here to the shrine to try to pay tribute to those who have fallen and lend his support, emotional support to Ukraine's people, and also loan guarantees, $1 billion, to help them withstand the pressure from Russia. Later, at a press conference, Kerry was still moved by the heroism of the protesters.
See the barricades, see the tires, see the barbed wire, see the bullet holes, the street lamps, the extraordinary number of flowers, the people still standing beside a barrel with a fire to keep them warm.
But earlier, at a checkpoint in Crimea, Russian forces fired warning shots at Ukrainian soldiers protesting the Russian occupation. And in his first comments since the crisis, a defiant Vladimir Putin spent an hour blaming the U.S. for starting the crisis, accusing the U.S. of meddling in Ukraine's affairs, reserved the right to use force, and even denied he had operational control of Crimea. He denied that there were any Russian troops in Crimea, occupying Crimea.
He really denied there were troops in Crimea?
Yes, he did.
I think that it is clear that Russia has been working hard to create a pretext for being able to invade further.
In Washington, the president tried to give Putin a way out.
There have been some reports that President Putin is pausing for a moment and reflecting on what's happened.
And now he has come to Paris, Kerry has left Kiev for meetings with the Russian foreign minister and with allied leaders. And on his plane, Brian, he brought with him Ukraine's acting foreign minister, who until recently was himself a protester in the square. The minister told me on the plane that he never thought he would be on the American Secretary of State's plane going to Paris to try to confront the Russians for his people. Brian?
All right, Andrea Mitchell, after a long day of traveling with the U.S. Secretary of State, with us tonight from Paris. Andrea, thanks. And we are joined once again tonight by the one man who may have the most recent and most valuable experience on this topic, Michael McFaul, who just days ago departed as U.S. ambassador to Russia to return to Stanford University. He is among the very best living experts on the region, the country, and the president, Vladimir Putin. We're happy to say he is also an analyst for us here at NBC News. So, Mr. Ambassador, how strange a feeling for everything you learned and studied about Vladimir Putin to be coming true right now in this kind of slow motion invasion with troops walking the streets, some of them with the safeties off their weapons and fingers on the triggers. There's no joy in the answer, but do you think we're looking at an eventual partitioning of Ukraine?
Well, it's most certainly a possibility. There's no doubt about it. If you listen to the President Putin's press conference today, I heard two very distinct contradictory messages. On the one hand, he said it was our fault that there was the revolution in Kiev and that we need to have a process to bring a legitimate government to Ukraine that he would recognize. And he said he had no intention of annexing Crimea. But on the other hand, he said because of the revolution, that was the word he used, in Kiev, Russia is no longer obligated to commit to international treaties and agreements that they signed with the previous Ukrainian government. That, to me, was a very threatening signal that there may be more to come.
And what will the next sign be that you'll be looking for? What is there a spot? Is there a timeline in this?
What makes me nervous in talking to government officials still in Moscow and elsewhere is they're looking for a pretext about violence. If there's violence out in the eastern parts of Ukraine, that will be the tripwire that they say, well, we need to go protect our Russian citizens. I want to be clear, there's been no violence in Crimea. Not a single person has been injured there, not a single Russian or Ukrainian. But if you do see violence, that would seem to me to be the next escalation moment for Vladimir Putin.
Former ambassador, now professor these days, Michael McFaul, thank you very much for being with us again this evening. We shift focus back here domestically, and here in this country, the weather is making news yet again with more cold, setting more new records in part of the Midwest and Mid-Atlantic. There was icing in the South again today. In Arkansas, they called out the National Guard to rescue drivers on I-40. The big storm that rolled across the country in recent days caused at least half a dozen deaths, most of them from wrecks on the highway. And this winter has taken an awful record toll on millions of people in this country, not just those in the parts of the country where the weather has been the worst. For starters, it has crushed the flying business. When airlines have to do those big block cancellations, hundreds at a time, it's a lot of numbers, but for each customer it means some sort of personal disaster of varying degree. Missed meetings, weddings, vacations, funerals, christenings, job interviews, all crushed by that old axiom, a snowstorm beats a jet aircraft every time. Tonight we have a look at the toll of this winter thus far. NBC's Tom Costello is with us for that. Hey, Tom, good evening.
Hi, Brian. 922 flight cancellations today. That's on top of the 5,000 we had on Sunday and Monday. For airlines and their passengers, this has been a winter of extremes. From the cockpit to the ramp, it's been a season of unrelenting snow and ice. Total cost to the airlines, airports, and travelers, nearly $6 billion. Double the typical winter.
Nearly every flight I've been on, or some segment, has had a delay.
At airports nationwide, passengers experiencing delays and cancellations nearly every day.
My flight was canceled yesterday, and so I'm flying out today instead.
Those three airways that are going to be closed, they're starting at 16:30.
At the FAA Command Center, they manage the nation's airspace. Who's flying, who's not, which airports are open or closed. On a typical day, the center handles 50 to 55,000 flights. The biggest challenge on a major storm is not necessarily the storm itself, but preparing for the recovery.
Primarily what we're concerned about is making sure that each airport and the airspace surrounding it is able to meet the demand upon it.
FlightAware.com reports that since November 1st, Chicago has suffered the most, 7.5% of all flights canceled. Surprisingly, Dallas was second, followed by Newark, Philly, LaGuardia, and Atlanta.
The airlines are looking at the weather, making these judgment calls way ahead of time when the situation gets risky for them.
United is among the airlines taking a more proactive approach, now trying to give customers 24 hours notice if their flight is canceled.
If we have to make flight cancellations, we want to impact the fewest number of customers possible. And so generally that leads us to cancel the flights with small airplanes and fewer people on those airplanes.
And that often means smaller regional planes. On the ground, it takes nearly as long to service than de-ice a regional jet as a bigger 737. But the 737 carries more passengers going longer distances. Now, the airlines are also complaining another factor here, the new FAA rules governing how long a pilot can work before he or she has to be off, in addition to the rules imposed limiting the amount of time passengers can be stuck out on the ramp, that those are also adding to delays and cancellations. And finally, because of all the airline mergers, there are fewer planes, fewer seats to help take up all the slack. Brian, back to you.
Tom, thank you very much. Stay on that side of the TSA line there at Washington National. And this is how it looked today in western New Jersey, where a huge explosion leveled a townhouse complex. Happened in Mercer County near the Pennsylvania border as utility crews were trying to repair a gas line that had been damaged previously by a contractor. One resident of the building was killed. At least 7 other people were injured. Amazing it wasn't higher a number. Oversees a dramatic day of testimony on day 2 of the murder trial of Oscar Pistorius. The former Olympic sprinter, double amputee, listened as a neighbor gave more testimony about what she heard that night when Pistorius shot and killed his girlfriend, Reva Steenkamp. And for the first time today, we heard from the victim's mother. NBC's Eamon Mohiuddin was in the courtroom again today in Pretoria.
The heavy rain didn't slow Oscar Pistorius' dash into court.
There's no mention about screaming.
Where today, the defense challenged Michelle Berger, the neighbor who testified she heard screams and gunshots from the direction of Pistorius' home.
You heard that out of a closed toilet and a house 177 meters away.
Berger, who didn't want to testify on camera, was overwhelmed.
This was awful to hear a shot before the shots.
It's been a very intense morning with one of the witnesses at least breaking down in cross-examination. She was wiping away tears while she was being questioned by the defense attorney. And throughout the entire morning, Oscar Pistorius was very engaged, listening intently, taking notes, and passing them on to his attorneys.
At times, he turned away as prosecutors built their case that he deliberately murdered his girlfriend, Reva Steenkamp.
I've lost everything that's important to me.
Reva's mother, on Today This Morning, never met Pistorius, but she was in court yesterday, hoping to look him in the eye.
He just walked into the courtroom and he looked straight ahead, and then he sat down and never looked my way.
She said she could forgive him.
It's actually important to forgive him, for me, because I don't want to live with bitterness in my life.
Eppa Goodney sees Oscar Pistorius in a different light. She traveled here from Iceland to show her support. We spotted her sitting quietly in the courtroom. Her son, born with the same condition as Pistorius, is also a double amputee. She contacted him 8 years ago, and they became friends.
He's a wonderful role model, not just because he runs fast. It's because he's a kind person. He's kind, he is polite, he's humble, he's just a very good example of a human being.
But with memories of Reva Steenkamp still fresh, how the rest of the world sees Oscar Pistorius will now be shaped in court. Eamon Mohiuddin, NBC News, Pretoria, South Africa.
And still ahead for us tonight, the price you pay, the skyrocketing cost of having a baby in this country, already the highest in the world. Tonight, why the cost is so unpredictable and who's paying the most. And later, the amazing scene on the side of the road, 95-year-old veteran of World War II, an emotional salute caught on camera. We are back with more of our ongoing series.